Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Noshin Premji, and I'm the Project and Events Coordinator here at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Tonight is a very, very special event, as we will have the opportunity to remember and celebrate the life and scholarship of our much-loved colleague and friend, the late Dr. Janis Esots. And in doing so, we will also be officially launching his book, Patterns of Wisdom in Safavid Iran, the Philosophical School of Isfahan and the Gnostic of Shiraz. So before we start this evening, I thought I'd tell you a little bit of a story about how we came to kind of organize tonight's event. And in organizing the flowers for tonight's event, I was reminded by a colleague that not only do these flowers symbolize, our love and our respect and our appreciation for Janis, but conveniently, they also represent the Latvian flag. So that's where Janis is from. It's from Latvia, and of course the red and the white symbolize that. So that's quite a lovely coincidence for us. Tonight's event will last approximately 1 hour, and that will be followed by light refreshments in the atrium. There will be an opportunity for questions to be asked towards the end of the event. For those of you joining us online, welcome, and please do submit your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will, of course, endeavour to get through as many of your questions as we can throughout the evening. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, I have a couple of housekeeping rules before we begin. We are not planning on having a fire drill tonight, so if the alarm does go off, it is a real fire. Please do make sure you exit the building and down towards where reception is, which is your closest exit. Also, please take a moment to ensure your mobile phones are on silent. You see a lot of you guys going into your pockets now, so that's great. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dr. Fârès Gillon. Fârès is a research associate with the Shii Studies Unit at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. A specialist in Fatimid thought, he is also interested in the wider field of Shii Islam and Islamic philosophy. As part of his work at the IS, he has been convening the Islamic History and Thought lecture series, which I'm sure he'll tell you more about towards the end of the lecture, which seeks to invite scholars to present and discuss their research. Please join me in welcoming Fârès.
Thank you very much, Noshin. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Aga Khan Centre and online. Almost a year has passed since Janis Esots' sudden and unexpected demise, and I am still, as I'm sure many others, under the shock of the loss of such a great and meticulous mind, and most of all, such an outstanding friend. It is therefore with sadness that I opened this event, in spite of the small consolation that Janis had completed and submitted his monograph before he passed away, thus transcending his bodily existence by leaving his major work to posterity. It would have been for Janis to present and defend his book tonight and discuss it with our two guests, whom I will present in a few minutes. No doubt that it would have been a memorable evening of philosophical debate. In his regretted absence, we will do our best to pay him homage tonight on both academic and personal levels. So this event will be divided in two parts. The first part will be dedicated to paying tribute to the late Janis Esots by reminding some of his contributions to the work done at the IAS and reminiscing on a more personal level. The second part will be dedicated to a critical discussion of the contents of Janis's book, and which will be by a panel form of two experts in Safavid thought, Professor Sajjad Rizvi and Dr. Mathieu Terrier. So in the first part, we will listen to 3 short communications before watching a short recording. I would now like to invite Dr. Gurdofarid Miskinzoda to the lectern. Dr. Gurdofarid Miskinzoda is the head of the Shii Studies Unit and Research Associate at the IAS, and she is also the managing editor of the Shii Heritage Series, where Janis' book was published. Dr. Miskinzoda will be presenting the Shii Studies Unit and how Janis' work fitted in the projects and aims of the unit. We will then listen to Dr. Maria De Cillis, Senior Research Associate at the IAS, and also Managing Editor of the Shii Heritage Series. Dr. De Cillis will present the series and its objectives and briefly present Janis Esots' book, which we will be discussing in more detail in the second part of the event. We had initially planned for Wendy Robinson, who is an editorial project coordinator and part of the editorial team at the IAS, to say a few words about Janis Esots' involvement in the Encyclopedia Islamica project. Due to unforeseen circumstances, she was not able to join us tonight, but has kindly sent a text, which I will then read. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fârès. The Institute of Ismaili Studies was established in 1977. We broadened our scope of work to include wider Shii studies beyond focusing predominantly on the Ismaili history and tradition, formally in 2010. Since then, we have implemented several important international projects, conferences, colloquia, and large-scale research and publication projects and teaching initiatives. The Shii Studies unit, to which most of us speaking here today belong, was established in 2014 with the aim of working towards turning the IAS into one of the leading institutions that engages in the scholarly study of Shia Islam. It aims to promote a better understanding of the history, doctrines, and practices of the Shia. Among our achievements in this regard are the development of a comprehensive Shii studies strategy, which was approved on the highest level by the full IAS Board of Governors, the establishment of the unit in 2014, which oversees the comprehensive implementation of that strategy, and the establishment of the Shii Heritage Series, about which my colleague De Cillis, Dr. De Cillis, will say more. The colloquium, the study of Shia Islam, the state of the field, issues and methodology, and recent developments that we held in 2010 and the related publication have been acknowledged as important milestones in the development of Shii studies as a separate field of studies in the study of Islam in general and religious and humanities, wider humanities. Moreover, all our books from the first one, and you can look at our books at display here, to the one that we are launching today, which is the most recent, have received predominantly positive reviews in peer-reviewed publications. Our late esteemed colleague, Dr. Janis Esots, was among the first scholars to be hired as a research associate as part of this move towards broader Shii studies. Let me say, Janis represented the ethos, quality, and rigor of how we want to work and what we want to achieve in Shii studies. From his encyclopedic knowledge to his exquisite knowledge of languages and editorial skills in several key languages of the field, to his amazing network of scholars, publishers, and friends all over the world. He also represented the epitome of a scholar of Shii studies that we look to produce through our educational and scholarship endeavors, and whom we would like to be part of our team. We miss him dearly, but I hope that the work that we continue to do, including the publication of this book, and which we are launching today, and his second book, The Renaissance of Shia Islam, co-edited with Dr. Daftari, which will be published towards the end of this year, will do justice to his dreams and aspirations.
It gives me great pleasure to see many of us here in this room, and I'm sure many are connected online as well, to remember Janis. And pardon me if I refer to him amicably as Janis, but obviously he was one of our dearest colleagues, so it just comes spontaneously to me. As my colleagues have mentioned, the untimely demise of Janis Esots has left us all deeply saddened, but also very shocked. And so it felt really spontaneous. It felt simply right to this book launch to pay homage not only to an esteemed colleague, but to a very generous friend, and to me personally, a brilliant mind. We are here to remember Janis, his kaleidoscopic abilities as a passionate scholar, as a skillful linguist, and as a very sensitive and generous man. He had many friends all over the world. He had many academic projects still going on, and obviously many personal dreams. And I personally remember him with his eyes shut, thinking deep in his thoughts, even when he was delivering a paper during a conference. Unfortunately, he left us without having the satisfaction to see his monograph published, but obviously we had it with us. So we have his legacy. His legacy keeps living on. Patterns of Wisdom in Safavid Iran, the Philosophical School of Isfahan, and the Gnostic of Shiraz is the 8th volume to appear in our Shii Heritage series. I'm just going to say a little bit about our series. The series was launched by the IIS with the Institute of Ismaili Studies, with the first publication, A History of Shii Islam, authored by Dr Fârès Gillon, appearing in 2013. And the principal objective of the series is to enhance general knowledge of Shii Islam and to promote a better understanding of its history, doctrines, and practices in their historical as well as contemporary manifestations. Addressing all Shii communities, the series also aims to engage in discussions in theoretical and methodological issues while inspiring further research in the field. All our books are double-blinded peer-reviewed by international scholars, and our editorial board can count on worldwide renowned experts in the field. Now, our publications fall into a number of interrelated categories, and Patterns of Wisdom in Safavid Iran sits perfectly within the second of such categories, which focuses on monographs exploring specific aspects of the Islamic faith and culture, as well as the contributions of individual thinkers and writers. And indeed, what Janis Esots has left us with is a mesmerizing journey exploring the exceptional intellectual richness of 17th century Safavid Iran, which according to him was epitomized by the Philosophical School of Isfahan, and in particular by its ostensible founder, Mir Damad, and his great student, Mullah Sadra. And to their respective Platonic and existentialist doctrines, Dr. Esots also speaks of the apophatic wisdom of Rajab Ali-Tabrizi. Now, this is a very original work, not least because Dr. Esots revisits the identification of the Philosophical School of Isfahan, which was proposed in 1956 by the celebrated French Islamologist Henri Corbin, who noted the unifying Islamic Neoplatonist character of about 20 intellectual and spiritual figures. Esots investigates the legitimacy of the term school and delves into the complexity of the doctrines and the philosophies of these major Shii figures and draws comparisons between their doctrines. So as my colleague, Dr. Gurdofarid Miskinzoda has mentioned, we have copies of all the books in the series, if you want to have a look at them. And obviously on your chairs, you also received a flyer. If you're interested in purchasing any of the copies, that will allow you to have about 35% off. Again, it's a good occasion now to remember that before his demise, Janis, together with Dr. Fârès Gillon, had been working on the proceedings of the international conference, The Renaissance of Shii Islam, which was held at the IIS, at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, back in October 2018. And we will have the editor volume coming out for publication around October of this year. Thank you.
So as announced, I will now read Wendy Robinson's text about Janis Esots' contribution to the project of the Encyclopedia Islamica. Janis Esots was first introduced to the IAS in 2012 by Dr. Reza Shah Kazemi, who had met him at the Islamic College, where Janis was teaching at the time. Janis initially joined the Encyclopedia Islamica project as a freelance translator of articles from Persian to English. After a short time, we recognized that by recruiting this brilliant scholar on the project, not only had we harnessed his impeccable knowledge of the Persian language and precise approach to translation, with the requisite expertise in the terminology of Islamic theology and philosophy, but that we would also go on to benefit from Janis's own scholarship of the intellectual history of the Persianate world, as well as his wider network of contacts in the field. For those not familiar with this major IAS project, Encyclopedia Islamica is a selective, abridged, and enhanced translation of the Iranian Da'irat al-Ma'arif fi Buzurgi Islami, published by the Center for the Great Islamic Encyclopedia in Tehran. With Professor Wilfred Madelung and Dr. Daftari as editors-in-chief, the encyclopedia aims to showcase a broad range of articles relevant to Islamic studies, with particular emphasis on Shiism, the history and literature of the Persianate world, and the philosophical and esoteric traditions, as well as Ismaili studies, among other aspects. To date, 6 volumes out of a projected 16 have been thus far been published. During his initial time on the project, Janis translated a number of entries on a broad range of topics, including Abd al-Qadir al-Baghdadi, al-Baladhuri, Argibam, Badihiyat, and al-Burujirdi. Before long, Janis joined the IAS as a full-time research associate, but continued to work on the encyclopedia in addition to his numerous other scholarly projects, some of the fruits of which are being recognized this evening. Over time, Janis's role on the encyclopedia evolved to one that was largely editorial. Janis was an assiduous editor, even though English was probably 4th among the many languages he deployed with true fluency and great facility. Before his death, Janis had risen to the position of managing editor. Janis also made significant authorial contributions to the encyclopedia. He wrote several entries for volumes 5 and 6, including one on causality, which traces the development of the concept from the Greek thought of Aristotle and Proclus through classical Islamic interpretation in Falsafa and Kalam, including in Illuminationist and Ismaili thought, down to the post-Hadrian Iranian philosophers. He wrote a definitive article on the life and work of Henri Corbin, the French philosopher and historian of religions, and major proponent of Shii thought, as well as an exhaustive entry on the 15th century philosopher and theologian Jalaluddin al-Dawani, one of the key representatives of the School of Shiraz, which includes several essential biographical and bibliographical information. And finally, there is a detailed article under the heading Eschatology, which places particular emphasis on the perspectives of Ibn Sina, Mir Damad, and Mullah Sadra regarding spiritual return as well as corporeal resurrection. He also co-wrote Burhan, specifically the section on the contributions of Muslim logicians to Aristotelian teachings on demonstration. Janis was scheduled to write further articles for our forthcoming volumes, contributions which have been forestalled by his untimely loss almost exactly a year ago. Looking back over the archive of our regular email communications over a period of nearly 10 years, I am struck once again by Janis's good humor, both in the sense of his being a courteous personality, always helpful and generous with his time, as well as in the sense that he could often be very funny, albeit sometimes in an exquisitely serious and almost inscrutable manner. I am also struck in retrospect by the notion that an encyclopedia was indeed a natural home for someone whose intellectual interests were so broad and whose contributions were accessible yet also exhibited a profound scholarship, specifically in respect of the many facets of Islamic philosophy. I'm sure I speak for everyone on the Encyclopedia team as well as his other IAS colleagues when I say that he is and will continue to be sorely missed. Thank you. So we will now display a video of the testimonies of two scholars who have kindly agreed to share some impressions and memories of their late friend and colleague Janis. We will first hear Professor Carmela Baffioni, who is a former full professor of history of Islamic philosophy at Università degli Studi di Napoli l'Orientale and senior research associate at the Institute of Ismaili Studies. She has recently been awarded the title of Professor Emeritus, and she specializes in the transmission of Greek thought into Islam and in Islamic philosophy, with a focus on the corpus of the epistles of the Brethren of Purity, Rasail Ikhwan Safa. We will then listen to Dr. Roy Vilozny, who was a close friend of Janis. Dr. Vilozny is a lecturer at the University of Haifa, and he is a specialist of early Shii hadith and has published several articles on this topic. Thank you.
I first met Janis in St. Petersburg in 1994. He was a young scholar, and thanks to him, I was able to get the Russian version of Kirmani's Sarahat al-Aql by Andrei Smirnov. We wrote to each other from time to time. He immediately involved me in the journal Ishraq that he edited with passion. It was a wonderful surprise to meet him again here at the IIS, where it was a feast to see him working with such enthusiasm and doctrine on the journal and his research, and talking about his travels to Russia and Iran. One of his last holidays I remember was in Sicily. The last time we saw each other in February 2020, immediately before the pandemic, he told me that we could meet whenever I liked, because he would be in London all summer apart from a short trip. What can I say? That was no longer possible, but his figure bent over his desk at work is always in my eyes and in my heart.
I first met Janis at two subsequent conferences in London and in Palermo in the summer of 2016. This first encounter was followed by a series of journeys on which Janis and I embarked together. Other than additional meetings in Russia and in England, all of our destinations were countries that had once formed part of the Soviet Union. Azerbaijan, in which the majority of the population are at least officially Imami, 12 or Shi'is. Tajikistan, which is predominantly Sunni, but we spent most of the time in the Badakhshan area, which is populated mainly by Ismaili Shi'is of the Nizari branch. And Uzbekistan, which is mostly Sunni, with a very rich Sufi heritage. In other words, we were traveling through areas corresponding to three of Janis's main scholarly interests: Imami Shi'ism, Ismaili Shi'ism, and Sufism. Accompanying Janis in those places was an eye-opening experience. My perception of these three manifestations of Islam, which had hitherto been based on written sources alone, was to gradually give way to a more dynamic view, one that takes into account the paramount role of living people in shaping their faith. But traveling with Janis was eye-opening not only due to our common interest in the religion and intellectual heritage of people residing in those regions. Janis was intimately acquainted, often to a higher degree than the local inhabitants, with the literature, poetry, history, geography, and politics of these countries. And of course, there were Janis's numerous friends and contacts everywhere. Rarely would a day pass without us meeting scholars, poets, translators, or writers who were all, and this was very easy to see, very fond of Janis. I would spend hours listening to discussions in Russian, Tajik, or Persian about poetry, philosophy, or any other subject that came up. Sitting mostly on a carpet, my back would start aching after a while, whereas Janis and the others seemed as if they could sit on the floor and keep talking and sipping tea forever. For a novice like myself in the territories of the former Soviet Union, this was a priceless initiation. In the time between our trips, we corresponded regularly. My mailbox contains dozens of emails from Janis and to him on various subjects. from the most mundane issues like the weather in London, which he really disliked, to proverbs in Russian or Persian, to pubs regulations during the COVID crisis, and to the infiltration of ideas of Middle Platonism into the thought of Fayyad Kashani, for example, or to the Safavid philosopher's perception of time, on which he elaborates in the book whose publication we are celebrating today. Reflecting upon the memories and impressions of Janis that I have, the famous joint journey of Moses and God's servant, which is described in Quran 18, Al-Kahf, and especially verse 78, "This is the parting between you and me," comes to mind. After all, it was my search for knowledge that led me to Janis. But yet, unlike in the Quranic story, although Janis was exceptionally generous in sharing his knowledge, the parting between us, and I assume that his many friends share this feeling, took place long before we had a chance to clarify all the riddles that formed part of our joint, way too short journey. May he rest in peace.
So for the second part of this event, I would like to invite our two panelists to come to the stage and to express my gratitude for their participation. Both had known Janis for many years and are experts in Islamic philosophy in general and Safavid philosophy in particular. Our first speaker is Professor Sajjad Rizvi, Professor of Intellectual History and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Among his numerous research interests, I will mention only a few, namely Islamic philosophy, Safavid philosophy, and particularly Mir Damad and Mullah Sadr, on whom he has published extensively, being a world specialist of the latter, and Shii thought in the broader sense, that is, comprising Twelver Shiism, Zaydism, and Ismailism. He has quite an impressive number of publications on these topics and others, and among them 2 books on Mullah Sadr. Our second speaker is Dr. Mathieu Terrier, a researcher affiliated to the Laboratoire d'études sur les monothéismes at the French National Research Centre. His research interests include his history of Islamic thought, Twelver Shii theology and philosophy, particularly of the Safavid period, and more broadly the relation between Falsafa, Shiism, and Sufism. He has published a French translation of a section of the Mahbub al-Qulub by Qutbuddin Ashkivari, who was a traditionist and philosopher from the Safavid period and a disciple of Mir Damad. And he has published several articles on other Safavid philosophers, among them Mir Damad and Mohsen Faiz Kashani, respectively master and disciple of Mullah Sadr. So each of the panelists will briefly present some comments and remarks on Janis Esots' book, and we will then have a discussion focusing on some of the points raised in the respective presentations. As time allows, I will then take some questions from the audience, both online and in the room. I will now leave the floor to Professor Sajjad Rizvi. Thank you.
Thank you, Fârès. And thank you everyone for coming. Before I say something about the book, let me say something about my own experience with Janis. I first met him in 1999 in Tehran, and in fact, I think most of my early meetings with him were either here or in Tehran. And then at some point, I was asked to act as the opponent for his PhD in Tallinn. So we went to Estonia for his Viva, which was one of these really strange European events where there are about 40 people there and anyone can ask any sort of question. And it was during summer. I remember I just couldn't sleep because the sun only went down for about 20 minutes. But Janis was a wonderful host at that point as well. And we would regularly meet here. We'd regularly have coffee around when the institute was in Victoria, we regularly had coffee across the and we would argue a hell of a lot. We disagreed on most things on Safavid philosophy. I'm sort of a bit saddened that I didn't send him my final disagreements on his book before it was published. And there were 2 things which I also remember very clearly. Someone mentioned his rather dry sense of humor. He was a wonderfully amusing gossip, academic gossip. He would find out the strangest details about people had things going on which you wouldn't realize, and that was quite an interesting insight, particularly in not just colleagues here, but around the world. The other thing was he took scholarship in Iran very seriously. This is something that the field really does need to do, is that it does need to engage with scholarship and secondary writing, which is undertaken in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. It's a fundamental requirement for the field of Islamic studies to be decolonized in that, particularly in that way. And that's very much present in this book as well. Now, coming to the book itself, the first thing which strikes me is the very title. I think the title is rather interesting, Patterns of Wisdom. The use of the word wisdom, which I guess captures the Arabic term hikmah, which is the standard word used in that period. We often, those of us who work in this, often translate it as philosophy. In some ways, wisdom is a bit more appropriate because it's a broader category. And perhaps we'll talk a bit more about this whole question of what the shortcomings or the limitations might be of the term philosophy. And of course, he does engage, as was mentioned earlier by Maria, with the this issue of what constitutes a school. Now, above and beyond that, there are three main chapters on three of these patterns. The first one being what he calls the actual Philosophical School of Isfahan, which he associates with Mir Damad and Mir Damad's metaphysics, and particularly the physics, or rather his idea of perpetual creation or perpetual inception, as he puts it. Also within that chapter, there is a certain discussion of eschatology, and I think it's important to mention that in the book you have basically a tripartite division of wisdom being put forward: metaphysics, physics, and eschatology, and that's something which is quite interestingly consistent. And in itself is interesting because eschatology is something which, if you ask most people who work on Arabic Islamic philosophy, they would not consider eschatology to be a philosophical topic. Of course, for those of us who have read Henri Corbin, it's quite the opposite. If you're not doing the eschatology, you're basically not doing the philosophy. So that's something that we can pick up later as well. The second chapter is on the Gnostic of Shiraz, by which he means Mullah Sadra. This was obviously the point at which I would massively disagree with him, because again, Gnostic has its own baggage and its own limitations as a term. So we can obviously argue about what Mullah Sadra means by an arif, what an arif is as opposed to a hakim, so basically a Gnostic as opposed to a wise person, a sage. But that brings its own kinds of limitations. In this section, this chapter, there's a very extensive discussion of Mullah Sadra's eschatology, which is a really serious contribution. It hasn't been done before. The third pattern that he presents is what he calls the apophatic wisdom associated with Rajab Ali Tabrizi and his particular school. Now, of course, and what he does is he quite neatly traces the elements of Neoplatonic thought which went into their work. There's still a lot we don't know about this particular school, partly because some of the texts have been published, others have not. And there actually currently is very little on them in pretty much any language. So in that sense, again, this chapter is a really serious contribution to the particular field. Now, those three patterns are then followed by a rather brief kind of comparative chapter, which is, partly what the disagreement is between Mullah Sadra and Mir Damad, and then what the disagreement is between Rajab Ali Tabrizi and Mullah Sadra. So kind of how the transmission of philosophical or ideas of wisdom are then engaged with. And then finally, there's a brief conclusion, which tries to trace elements of reception. And I think the reception issue is important. Why, in a sense, are these patterns of philosophies of significance, from the Safavid period to the present, what happened to them? Of course, for those of us who are familiar with the history, what happens is basically Mullah Sadra wins the day, the others pretty much disappear and end up in broad oblivion, apart from the odd rather erudite, but esoteric and colleagues in the sciences would say irrelevant manifestations here and there. So that's the broad scheme of the work. At one point, I believe it's in the conclusion, he says that, you know, all that he's really presenting is almost like a set of footnotes on Kolba and Nasr. And this is, you know, Janis's rather characteristic humility, but it's also, I suspect, a bit of a dig, because I also know what he did think of Kolba and Nasr. So it's not just a series of footnotes. There are some very significant disagreements with Nasr and Kolba, which are here as well, but it's really for the reader to pick up on those disagreements. Let me just say one more minute, and then I'll pass to Mathieu. So just to pick up some of what I think are the really big questions which this book raises. The first one is what I mentioned earlier. You know, what do we really mean by philosophy? What does this term wisdom mean? What does Gnosticism mean? What are their limitations and how do they relate to each other? The second one is this whole question of how we take eschatology seriously. You know, how do we analyze it philosophically? And that has, of course, very significant implications for other philosophical schools in Islam, not least various Ismaili ones. I mean, if any of you have ever read Abu Yaqub Sijistani, you'd realize that you know, eschatology is very significantly a philosophical point of contemplation. The third one relates to Neoplatonism. One of the texts which is extensively discussed in the book is the Orthologia, the so-called Theology of Aristotle, the paraphrase from the Abbasid period of Enniads 4-6 of Plotinus. And it's a very large kind of influence and motif which runs through pretty much all writings in that period. It also begs the question of, well, what's missing? So this, you know, it's important to realize this is not an exhaustive study of wisdom, patterns of wisdom in the Safavid period. There's much which is missing. For example, the whole Avicennian tradition is broadly missing. Or rather, as I would put it, he's only taken one strand of the Avicennian tradition, which is Nidama. He's ignored the other strands. And then the final question, which he doesn't take head on, but I assume Mathieu will definitely take on, which is this broader question of what does this actually mean for Shii philosophy? Is there such a thing as Shii philosophy, which is of significance when we are dealing with these particular thinkers in this period? It's somewhat of a lacuna in the work that he does not engage, for example, with Mullah Sadr's tafsir or his commentary on hadith, or indeed of Mir Damad or the other figures who works on it. One figure who he could have placed broadly in the Rajabli Tabrizi school could have been Qazi Sayyid Qummi, and Qazi Sayyid Qummi has extensive commentaries on hadith which are extremely significant because of what they say about the nature of it. So I will stop. I've gone far too long and pass over to Mathieu. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sajjad. Thank you very much, Fârès, and all the people here in the Institute. I'm very honored and pleased to have been invited to participate to remember our friend and late colleague, Janis Esots. The book of our late friend Janis Esots is certainly a major contribution to a field of study that was opened up in the middle of the last century and which has since been the subject of a number of further developments and discussions, but which is still far from being fully investigated. A major contribution not only for the set of information that it establishes and gathers in a methodical and pedagogical fashion, but also for its philosophical analysis and the new proposals that it formulates on the history of ideas between antiquity and modern Iran. In this concise monograph, written in a clear and elegant language, devoid of any abstruseness, but tinged with irony and modesty, in accordance with his personality, Janis Esots reconsiders the historiographic scheme of the Philosophical School of Isfahan, set up by the French Orientalist Henri Corbin and his Iranian colleague Said Hossein Nasr, in order to highlight the renaissance of Islamic philosophy in the 17th century Safavid Iran. For this purpose, the book focuses on three thinkers commonly associated with this school: Mir Damad, Mollah Sadra, and Rajab Ali Tabrizi, whose works he studies first in their internal structures and then in their reciprocal dialogical relations. Through a historical review and a philosophical inquiry, Janis Esots convincingly shows that the paradigm of the Philosophical School of Isfahan, as established by Corbin and Nasr, has now exhausted its heuristic potential. In this time, it was Mir Damad who was acknowledged as the principal philosopher. Sadra was likely to follow his teaching for a certain period, but contrary to popular belief, circumstantial evidence shows that he never belonged to Mir Damad's inner circle, and textual evidence that he was never deeply influenced by Mir Damad. Moreover, in his mature works, Sadra tacitly dismissed the core teaching of Mir Damad, such as the principality of quiddity, and supported entirely new and often contradictory positions. It is thus, I quote Janis, difficult to claim that these two key thinkers share a common doctrine, and as Janis emphasizes, it is meaningless to speak of a philosophical school in the absence of a prevailing, commonly recognized doctrine. In return, one of the principal followers, if not students, of Mir Damad, Rajab Ali Tabrizi, set out to refute Sadra's more original arguments, such as the systematic ambiguity of existence and the substantial motion. Thus, according to Janis, the two falsafa-focused circles led in Isfahan by Mir Damad and Rajab Ali Tabrizi can be viewed as two subsequent stages in the development of the same philosophical school. Hence, the titles of two chapters of the book, School of Isfahan 1 and 2, two stages and two chapters, separated by the Sadrian rupture or dissidence. It is only in the Qajar period that Mollah Sadra, the Gnostic of Shiraz, supplanted Mir Damad, the philosopher of Isfahan, as the principal master of truth, and that the Gnosticization or Irfanization of philosophy reached its fulfillment. Janis does not only confront in an objective and analytical way the arguments of Mir Damad and Mollah Sadra on the principality of essence or existence, the relations between motion and substance, the conception of time and eternity, but also the fate of the human soul. Moreover, he opposes their patterns of thought, i.e. their conception of what thinking means or must mean. To the wisdom of the right side, as Janis translates al-Hikmah al-Yamaniya, claimed by Mir Damad, a falsafa-oriented thought in the restricted technical meaning of the term falsafa, he opposes the transcendent wisdom, al-Hikmah al-Muta'aliya, of Mollah Sadra, a gnosis or irfan-oriented thought in the transcendent historical meaning of the term gnosis as used by Corbin, that of a transforming and saving knowledge culminating in the divinization of the self. Last, the apophatic wisdom of Rajab Ali Tabrizi represents a third distinct pattern of thought built on the foundations of Mir Damad's system and the criticism of Mollah Sadra's. Janis reads those philosophers as a philosopher himself, while analyzing their principle of thought, but also while criticizing some inconsistencies or flaws in their systems. And whether on historical facts or on philosophical concepts, Janis always applies the Socratic maxim to know and to say that you don't know. To expose and compare in such a concise, systematic and critical way the works, the patterns of thought and the main arguments of the three thinkers, philosophers and or Gnostics, would be enough to make the book of great interest. But it also provides a new historiographical proposal of high interest. A proposal breaking discreetly but radically with the seminal views of Corbin and Nasr. Indeed, Janis carries out what can be called a denosticization or de-Irfanization of the Isfahan school of philosophy and Mir Damad thought in particular, while attributing to Mullah Sadra and even more so to his disciples, like Fârès Gillon, the conversion of philosophy to gnosis, or in Janis' words, its subordination to gnosis as a mere introduction to it. But Janis also operates what I could say a de-Shiitization of the Safavid philosophy as represented in the works of Corbin and Nasr, while the latter was seeing the works of both Mir Damad and Mullah Sadra achieved expressions of the Shii gnosis, Irfan Shii, emerged from the alliance of falsafa, spiritual training of Sufism, and the esoteric teachings of the Imams. Janis focuses on the properly philosophical or metaphysical issues and arguments discussed by the two masters, such as, again, the transipality of essence and existence, difference and relations between the material and the immaterial, the temporal and the perpetual worlds. Among all their works, Janis gives a clear precedence to those addressing especially these issues, and tends to minimize or marginalize those dealing with exegesis or theology, such as in Mir Damad, the commentary of the Psalms attributed to the fourth Imam, as-Sahifa Sajjadiyah, or in Mullah Sadra's, the Quranic tafsir and the commentary of the Usul al-Kafi of Al-Kulayni. This philosophical commitment, apparently in favor of a philosophy independent of religion and culture, goes hand in hand with a philological approach to the text. In his notes and commentaries, Janis uses a brilliant erudition to trace the origin of Mir Damad's and Mullah Sadra's insight in Greek sources, mainly Neoplatonic, but also, as for Mullah Sadra, Stoic, Greek sources that our late friend mastered as well as Arabic and Persian ones. When reading these fascinating connections, the question inevitably arises: are there really sources or rather similarities? Are we dealing with a history of thought or with a comparative essay? Something in between, al-amr bayn al-amrayn, Janis seems to answer in advance. For although he readily admits that Mir Damad and Mullah Sadra did not generally read the precise text he mentions, he nonetheless maintained that their thought belongs by right to the tradition of Hellenistic Arabic philosophy. For what concerns Mir Damad, he proposed to consider him, I quote, as primarily a Platonic and only secondarily an Avicennan philosopher, in spite of the ebbs and flows in attitude towards another great Platonist, Shirabeddin Sohrawardi. His wisdom on the right side may be considered as an alternative reading of the Arabic Plotinus and Proclus, and ultimately as an insightful reflection on the eternal themes of Platonism. As for Sadra thought, he recognizes in it, I quote, a stoicizing teaching on providence, and in his ontology in particular, a variety of Platonism modified in accordance with the implication of the doctrine of the systematic ambiguity of existence, or even a vague and distorting reinterpretation of Platonism. In so doing, Janis intends to re-establish Mir Damad as a philosopher in the classical sense, according to the historical and epistemological criteria shared by many philosophers and historians of philosophy, criteria that Corbin, for his part, exceeded in order to give philosophy a meaning close to gnosis from the outset. According to Janis, Mullah Sadra, unlike Mir Damad, was a Gnostic rather than a philosopher, but it seems that this very orientation owes more to Greek sources than to the influence of Shii esotericism or Sufi mysticism. Personally, I do not entirely agree with this conception of what philosophy in general should be, i.e. an essentially rational and argumentative discipline focused on defined objective problems based uniquely on the Greek heritage, and what the philosophy of Mir Damad and his students in particular is. I would give more importance to the practice of hermeneutics, to the authority of the Imami tradition, and to the ideal of the mystical knowledge in the works of both Mir Damad and Mullah Sadra. Concerning the former, I still think that his Yemeni wisdom, another more obvious translation of Al-Hikmah al-Yamaniya, and Sajjad will confirm, intended to go beyond Greek philosophy, and not only to pursue it, precisely by the privilege of a divine inspiration, which was at least conceived, if not lived, within the religious framework of Immanuel. In the expectation of hope of being able to discuss spiritually with Janis on these issues one day in the realm of perpetuity and in Persian, of course, may he forgive me for sharing these few remarks in public. However, it is to underline in conclusion the main merits of this book, for which I would like above all to express my gratitude to you. To offer a clear and enlightening synthesis of such voluminous and difficult text, to convince specialists of Western philosophy, specialists and students of Western philosophy, that the works of these turban-wearing thinkers, contemporaries of Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz, do possess, in regard to them, their own philosophical interest and intelligibility. And last but not least, to put forward suggestive proposals and perspectives that are likely to raise discussions and new analyses and further fertilize the field of study of Iranian, not to say, or to say Islamic or Shii philosophy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mathieu, and thank you both for these very insightful comments. I think we really get an extremely good notion of what the book is, what it is about, and its contribution to the field. So, I mean, there are many themes that I could pick up from what you said. Unfortunately, we will not have time to tackle them all, but I would like to start with the most obvious, which is also in the title of the book, the very notion of a school of thought. Janis acknowledged that Henry Corbin was fully aware of the differences between the major thinkers of this so-called school. Yet he did not believe, Janis, that it was enough to characterize the existence of a school, and in his introduction he provides a definition of the notion of school as presupposing, and I quote, the existence of a teacher and disciples and a doctrine established by the former and endorsed, developed by the latter, and core texts that expose the aforementioned doctrine. And this definition that he gave was building on a definition of the school Sajjad Rizvi had given in an article on the Isfahan School of Philosophy, an article in which Sajjad also questioned the existence of such a school. So my question maybe is very naive, but do you believe the differences between the three authors that Janis discusses in his book, and particularly between Mir Damad and Mullah Sadra, are indeed important enough to justify the rejection of the idea of the School of Isfahan? And if you do, this raises another question. Since Corbin was aware of these differences, why did he forge this concept, nevertheless? And is this due to a fundamental difference between Corbin's and Janis Esots' respective approaches as to the definition of what is a school of thought? If I may, I will just maybe say a few words about my second question, which regards the singularity of Mullah Sadra, which I think is probably the main point of the book. So even though Janis wants to reassert that Mullah Sadra was not considered a major thinker of his time, and this is something that he also said to me when we were discussing his book informally, and he would repeat that over and over again, that Mullah Sadra was not an important thinker in his time, and that the importance that is given to him nowadays is a later construction, and that at that time the real major thinker was Mir Damad, even for several decades after Mir Damad's death. But paradoxically, Janis in his book emphasizes the singularity of Mullah Sadra, and this maybe a key to understand Mullah Sadr's success in later times by emphasizing this singularity. So what, in your opinion, does this singularity consist of? Yeah, I will stop here for now.
I talked a lot, please.
I mean, on the first one, on the School of Isfahan question, I guess Kofa has had a broader conception of what philosophy is, and within that, in some ways, I guess the particular doctrinal distinctions are not so important. It was about how does one define philosophy? How does one define philosophy as some sort of sacred esoteric teaching, and also what sort of hermeneutics of the text and the self does it involve? And in that sense, you could say that there are links between these various thinkers. So one is this whole question of what is the relationship between, say, the Yunani and the Yemeni? I think that's a feature of all these thinkers. What is, how do they think of that Greek heritage, and how do that relate to kind of a prophetic heritage, and particularly the heritage of the hadith of the Imams? So that's certainly one element, and the other element could be what are the particular texts with which they're engaging, and those texts are common. So even if they don't necessarily have agreements on how they read it, I mean, my own thinking is that it ultimately does come back to different readings of Avicenna in this period. And there are some very distinct readings of Avicenna, and Mullah Sadr actually is a reading of Avicenna, in as much as Mir Damad is also a reading of Avicenna. So there could be different ways in which you could conceive of the school. I don't think Koba would necessarily be massively tied to the school as a conception, beyond what he has to say about philosophy and esotericism, which I think will far more significant. And on the and actually one thing which Koba does pick up on, and which is very important in all of these thinkers, and especially in Mullah Sadr, I think says the most about it, is this concept of the alim rabbani. I mean, Sadr discusses it extensively with respect to Shii hadith. So the alim rabbani is kind of this lordly scholar, someone who knows, but rabbani in the sense of directly from the Lord, right? And this, of course, in the hadith is actually a description of the Imam, but the idea is that the sage, the hakim, should reflect it in some way as well, but ultimately should follow the model of the alim rabbani, who is the Imam, and that's a very significant theme, which is true, I think, of all of these figures, whether it's Rajab Ali Tabrizi, whether it's Mullah Sadr, whether it's Mir Damad, whether it's Qadi Sayyid Qummi, etc. If anything, the straightforward Abyssinians don't fit in this box because they're not terribly reflective about what they're doing. So that, I think, that is an important issue. On the second question of was Sadr a leading figure of his time? Well, he's right. Mir Damad probably was more famous, but then why wouldn't he be? He was Shaykh al-Islam. I mean, he was probably the most important figure as such in Isfahan, especially by the time you get to the 1620s and after Shah Wahid died. So there's no doubt about that. But I'm not sure you could dismiss Mullah Sadr as being a minor figure who is somehow resurrected 100 odd years later. I mean, certainly he becomes very famous about 150 years later, but we do have attestations of Mullah Sadr close to the time. We do have examples of people engaging. I mean, the fact that the Rajab Ali Tabrizi school, the fact that someone like Mullah Shamsa Gilani, who is a student of Mir Damad, are actually engaging and responding to Mullah Sadr as said, and even those who really hate philosophy and Sufism are engaging with Sadr as the real threat. That shows you that he is an important figure, and he was recognized as an important figure already by his contemporaries. But certainly, I think the point that Mathieu was making about sadness as a rupture. I think that's quite an interesting way of putting it. But then, if you take a more teleological approach, you'd say, well, he's not the rupture, it's the others who are kind of a strange moment in the middle, and then he kind of ushers in the beginning of something.
Yeah, I mostly agree with what you said. I would just add that when Henri Corbin invented the concept of the Philosophical School of Isfahan, it was on the basis of one text of Mirdamad, which Janis Esots analyzes and reinterprets in a strange way in his book. It's a Risala Halreya, which is the report of a spiritual experience or visionary experience, to quote Corbin, that Mirdamad had in a mosque of the city of Qom. And the invention of the concept of the Philosophical School of Isfahan for Corbin was to say that this thinker Mirdamad was a master of peripatetism and a mystic with such a spiritual experience and spiritual attestation of his thought. And it was a conjunction of the peripatetism or the rationalism, let's say, and the mysticism, which defined for Corbin the Philosophical School of Isfahan. And that's why, in his perspective, it was a logic to include Mullah Sadra, and I agree. And also, Christian Jambé told me many times that Mirdamad and Mullah Sadra disagree on their principles, but they respond to the same issues, the same problems, and they have the same program. And the program is to be divine scholars, or to have this ilm rabbani and this experiential and presential knowledge. So in this perspective, we can keep the concept, but I agree with Janis that it's at the end it doesn't make much sense to conserve the expression of a philosophical school of Isfahan for thinkers who disagreed and for thinkers who did not live or teach in Isfahan, like Mullah Sadra and like other disciples of Mirdamad. And but the continuation of the Philosophical School of Isfahan through the Rajab Ali Tabrizi circle is an interesting hypothesis, which is also discutable, but well, Janis at the end saves the concept of the Philosophical School of Isfahan after having criticized it.
Yes, just to, I mean, what I meant when I mentioned the singularity of Mullah Sadra, I meant that maybe it was precisely this singularity that made his success in later times. So I think Janis, one of the points he made is that, so you both talked about this, about the Irfanization of philosophy. This distinction Janis made between Irfan focused circle led by Mullah Sadra and two Falsafa focused circles in Isfahan. So I believe this raises a question that you both mentioned, namely the meaning of philosophy. What do we mean by philosophy? Is it synonymous to Falsafa, or can it also include Gnosis, and also that may be revealing to Janis's own conception of philosophy, although I'm not sure he would have reduced it to Falsafa exclusively, but
well, I mean, this is where we always have the kind of the elephant in the room, which is Dimitri Kutas and his particular conception of philosophy. And this is something we discussed many times. Janis always had very good gossip on Dimitri. But I mean, there is this problem of the field that, you know, do we necessarily have to you know, perpetuate basically a rather narrow Eurocentric conception of what philosophy is, which is predicated on a particular notion of rationality? Or rather, you know, should we be, you know, brave enough to say, well, on the one hand, we don't necessarily have to be wedded to the term philosophy, but on the other hand, if we're going to use it, we're going to use it in our particular way. And that own particular way means that a commentary in the Quran can be philosophical, and a commentary in Hadith can be philosophical, and, you know, a discussion of what happens to the soul can be philosophical, and also a discussion of, you know, who are the people on the ramparts, or on the Araf, or who are those on the Aliyin. These are properly philosophical problems, and clearly in the work of someone like Mullah Sadr, they are problems of hikmah. He explicitly defines those works in which he discusses these as hikmah. And so I think that, but then of course, as I said, you know, for the more narrow school, that's already a problem, because for them hikmah is not philosophy. So all that later stuff which is defined as hikmah, you can pretty much dismiss as not being philosophical. So I suspect Janis's own position is somewhat in the middle of the Gurdofarid and myself. And yeah, but for me, I think that it's an important decolonial problem. What do we think philosophy is, and do we necessarily have to kind of genuflect to conceptions of philosophy which may not be at all relevant to thinkers that we. And it raises also this wider question of, you know, what is the significance of these patterns of wisdom for the modern period as well? Now, of course, we know there's an extended kind of commentarial, almost scholastic tradition of Mullah Sadr, which has, you know, equal parts, sometimes kind of more philosophical orientations, sometimes more mystical orientations. But it also does, I think, raise very significant questions about the sorts of texts and inspirations that we have when we think about philosophy. As I said, you know, how do you read the Quran philosophically? How do you make sense of poetry? And, you know, how do you convey philosophical ideas in poetry? You know, the very sort of experiences which seem to us to be central to what we are as humans. You know, most of us do not spend all our time reading rather turgid philosophical treatises, but pretty much everyone who's reading, I think, does engage with philosophical questions. We just don't do it in the same way that some conception of rationalism, you know, thinks that we should be doing.
Yes, I agree with this. I would say that first that, of course, Greece is not more Western than Eastern. It's quite in the middle between, geographically, between Iran and France, maybe, I don't know, but maybe closer to Iran. And so, of course, the legacy of Greek wisdom and philosophy, because also Pythagoras was considered more as a sage, as a wise man than a philosopher. And so this legacy is is completely received by the Safavid philosophers, and they really see themselves as the inheritors of this legacy, and they do not imagine that maybe in the Western Europe there is some other inheritors of this legacy, and they don't care of it. But also the Safavid philosophers, and I think it's true for Mir Damad and Mullah Sadr and the others, they do not see, and that's why this is not only falsafa, they do not see the separation of the distinction we learned between philosophia and sophia. Philosophia as a search of Sophia, which never reached its goal, and the philosopher is the one who just, as I quote Socrates, he knows that he doesn't know and he's not wise. But for Mirdamad, Molla Sadra, and the others, and maybe as for Plato and Plotinus, the philosophy is the real quest of wisdom. So they really try to reach their goal, and there is not theoretical definitive separation between philosophy and wisdom, or philosophy and gnosis, because gnosis is the transforming and saving, and divinizing knowledge, and that's exactly what the Greek philosophers were searching for. Even Epicurus, the most materialist, was in search of the self-divinization through wisdom, and he was considered as a divine wise man by his disciples. So in this perspective, I think that the Safavid philosophers, the Iranian philosophers, are real inheritors of this legacy of Greek philosophy and wisdom, which are not to be separated.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I understand that there shouldn't be a radical separation between philosophy and Irfan, but what is it that I think you both agree that Molla Sadra really stands out among these thinkers, and hence the relevance of the rejection of the notion of school of Isfahan. But what is it that makes Molla Sadra radically different? I mean, as far as I can tell from Janis's analysis, well, obviously there's this notion of principality of existence. I think also the importance of the oneness of existence, the idea that for Molla Sadra there is only one real existent, and that the diversity of beings is due not to differences in quiddities, but in variations in the intensity of existence. Are there any other concepts or ideas that, in your opinion, may explain this radical difference of Molla Sadra?
Please. I mean, it's primarily about metaphysics. So, there are a number of places in his oeuvre where he talks about his 11 principles that you need to understand, which are all metaphysical principles, and they are all principles, practically all principles, which the other thinkers in this period would have disagreed with. So, everything from Asal al-Wujud to Tashkik, to, how does the reference of existence work, and, how the hierarchy of existence, etc. works. So I think it is primarily about metaphysics. It's about the privileging also of metaphysics, which I think is quite significant in his work. And then, working out what metaphysics then entails for other areas, such as ethics, such as hermeneutics of the text, and so forth. I think that kind of continuity from metaphysics to other areas of philosophy is also very important. So in that sense, Sadra is very much a classic foundationist. Everything stems from that. And that's true of the Sadrian tradition all the way to the modern period. So you cannot make sense of the ethics and politics if you don't understand metaphysical foundations. The same thing goes for hermeneutics and reading of texts. The same thing goes for issues in epistemology and psychology and so forth. And that's precisely his point about articulating these 11 principles, which, at least in one place, he says is essential for understanding the eschatology. So even the eschatology you cannot make sense of unless you can understand the metaphysics. So in that kind of programmatic sense, I think he's important. And that is actually similar to what Mir Damad, even though Damad does not have the same principle. So, when it comes to the problem of creation, now, of course, Janis does discuss this within physics. I wouldn't put it there. I think that's a classic mistake. And in fact, that's also where the critics of Mir Damad got it wrong, because they thought that the argument about creation was a problem of physics. Well, you would think that if you were an Aristotelian, but Mir Damad is not coming from that perspective. For him, this is a problem of metaphysics. And you can use that metaphysics then to solve problems in physics, but it's not an issue of physics. And the same kind of programmatic approach, I think, to the metaphysics is there. And for that, the really important work of Mir Damad is Al-Fiqh al-Mubin. A lot of that chapter, I think, that's the real contribution. It's based on Al-Fiqh al-Mubin, which is his great metaphysical work, on which there's hardly any studies at the moment. So in that sense, I think there is that sort of broader programmatic approach which is important. But as I said before, the other significant thing about Sadra is, this massive tafsir and this commentary on Usul al-Kafi. I mean, put together, we're talking about a work which is larger than most of his major philosophical works. And some of them are wonderfully interesting. No one's, for example, studied his hadith on the Junud al-Aql wal-Jahl. So, the famous hadith about, the intellect has certain forces, and it's kind of clashing with these forces of ignorance. Now, of course, this is ethics. That's precisely what ethics is, but it's based on a kind of metaphysical kind of realization of what these things are. And that's one of the longest commentaries in the whole work is on this one particular hadith. And that's the sort of stuff that people, if you really don't understand philosophy, you have to engage with that stuff.
Thank you. Mathieu,
you
want to?
Yeah, just a small one. Yeah, I think the principality of existence and the idea of Janis talks about the ambiguity of existence, but also the intensification of existence. The process of intensification of existence is a real new paradigm that Mullah Sadra brought to Islamic philosophy. And I think also what is fascinating in Mullah Sadra is how he gathers all the history of Islamic philosophy and also the theory of Ibn Arabi. I mean, the Asfar and the other works of Mullah Sadra are plenty of quotations without names, and it's a real gathering of everything was thought in the Islamic world. And by doing this, he creates a new paradigm, which is really okay. He had forerunners certainly, but it's a really new paradigm which would eventually influence deeply the modern and contemporary philosophical inquiry in Islam world.
Thank you very much.
Can I just make one comment about the Shii stuff? Because I think I think again this is one of the classic issues. So I find it disturbing that there's some kind of what I would call European language studies of Mullah Sadra are so insistent on kind of de-Shiifying him, which I find very problematic. And this is probably also true of Mir Damad. And I would just remind you of one very small thing, perhaps not a small thing, but Mullah Sadra in his tafsir, and Damad does it in the Jazabat, they have this very interesting reflection, which actually in the Safavid period becomes commonplace. So the reflection is this, that one of the keys of the Quran are the so-called separated letters, the huruf muqatta'a, right? Now if you gather together the huruf muqatta'a and the different letters that they constitute, you can come up with all sorts of word phrases from that. But the phrase that they both agree on, pretty much every Safavid thinker agrees on, is Siratu Aliyin Haqqun Mamsuku. So the path of Ali is truth, or reality, or whatever you want to translate, Haqq, that we traverse, that we walk along. And now that's kind of as Shii as you get, as a kind of a philosophy of life and as an approach. And that's something that it's astonishing that people would just put that aside as if it doesn't exist. It's there in the tafsir, it's there in the jazabat, it's there in many thinkers. That's not some sort of apologetic, but I have to put that in because people will, attack me. They really believe that's truth. And that Shii aspect is absolutely essential.
Thank you for this final point, Sajjad, and this concludes our session today. I would like to thank the events team and the staff involved in the organization of the event. Thank you, obviously, to Professor Carmela Baffioni and Dr. Vilozny for their valuable testimonies, and thank you to Professor Rizvi and Dr. Terrier for your very insightful comments on these books and on the topics tackled by the book. I would just like to take the opportunity to mention that our next event will be organized by the IS, will be online within the Islamic History and Thought lecture series, and we will have PhD candidate Alex Matthews, who will talk about an Ismaili text, the book of interim and planetary conjunction, Fatimid Ismaili texts. All the information is available on the IAS website, so I strongly encourage you to register to attend this online event. The audience is now invited to partake in the refreshments offered in the hall of the Aga Khan Centre. Thank you again for your presence.
Thank you.